Okay, so the next part of the program, it will be a discussion among the panel led by Donlyn Lyndon, and it will be a chance maybe for Will to catch his breath and us all to catch our breath, and for the panelists to think further based on what they've seen, what they've heard from each other, and Donlyn, thanks for moderating, so come on up. It'll take us just a few minutes. We want to remove the cart here so there can be a little better sight lines. So a little patience, but you all and Donlyn, come on up. So following the panel, then we will have a break and then come back with your questions for the panel. And we have lots of time for that piece too, so.
Well, things are rearranging, and before we start the panel, I'll take the opportunity to add a couple of notes and to once again invite you to look at an imaginary slide, because this time I've got the slide, but it's being carried away. The slide was the one that I meant to end on, but got rattled by the timing, and is one that many of you will be familiar with. It was an event on September 1st this year, a short time ago, which was Anna Halprin's conducting a score for building community, she called it. And it was a kind of bringing back that notion of engagement with the environment, bringing back that notion of engagement with each other, bringing back the idea of movement workshops that could actually help us all to understand the place better. And I won't go through a description of the whole event, but there's a wonderful photograph you no doubt have many of you seen of the whole, I think there were 60 people there, who participated in this in a big circle holding hands and being a part, being aware, having spent 2 hours being more alert to the environment than we normally are, and finding common ground in that and seeing that as a way of moving forward to a future that has roots in the past. Yeah. So that's what I hope have imagined in your head. I also want to reinforce what was just said about the design committee. One of the things I failed to do in my summary earlier is to speak directly to how hugely important the design committee has been in keeping this place as it is and letting it change and grow in the process. And the design committee, as if any of you don't know, is in the position of approving any improvement, landscape or architecture, to this environment. They in fact are in the business of approving our commons landscape suggestions. And they have been enormously diligent and a great force. And two of the people who were part of the original team, Dick Whitaker and George Homsey, are on that committee now. But there may be more questions or discussions about that later, but I needed to call it out. Finally, just a comment on one of the other slides. The photograph that was of Haystack, the Edward Barnes project that Chris showed, lovely photograph. I remember distinctly the day we were interviewed by Al Bokie. We had been very aware of the Haystack project, and everybody was. That was really being published and enjoyed at that point, and that was designed by Edward Larrabee Barnes. At the end of our interview, after Al looked at all of our work, going out the door, he said, with a twinkle in his eyes, "It looks Barnes-like enough for me." And he meant both this Barnes and Edward Larrabee Barnes. And that combination of thinking about structures of the place and thinking about where this sat in the culture of the time was what we were about. So, now, having exploited some of the time here, I thought you might like that little story. The thing I think we might lead with very simply in the panel, we might just ask, and you've already told us in some level, but maybe just in a recap. You've been here now. You've been here before, all of you. You've been here for a time now. You've been hearing each other talk about what this place is, and you've been talking to people out there. I mean, that's actually the number of times that various speakers have spoken about how much they learned from the people they've met just in these 2 days here is a wonderful sign of what kind of people they are, as well as what kind of people you are. But perhaps you could each say something about, in all of that in the last few days, what has become a new insight or a new idea about the place that you have learned from this set of exchanges. I'll take volunteers, otherwise I'll take executive action. You'll start? Oh, good, thanks.
Can you hear me? If I lean forward, can you guys hear me in the back? I would say simply that I've been reminded again, well, the few days that we've been here, all of us, and especially today, I've been reminded that this was a place that the world, really, the architecture world, was looking to and learning from, particularly students, as many of you have said. And I think that is the idea that seems most powerful and persuasive, is how do we make this a place that the world can look to and learn from once again?
Well, I would add to that I think it's, and I think that what makes it so timely is I don't think this place has had, it has so much relevance once again. I think that's so important, that thinking about the broader meaning of sustainability and land use and how it's limited. You know, there is a great opportunity, as future Mayor Will Bruder just telling us. But you know, I think that's something that we all feel very positive about. Also, somebody I was talking to briefly over lunch, and we were talking about how people don't really talk about architecture anymore. They talk about real estate, and you know, Sea Ranch has been very much caught up in that in the last couple of decades, and it's a real concern.
I think what I've learned since I've been here, and I think it's a product of the, being on the tour yesterday and talking to people and being in all these houses and talking to the homeowners. I knew before I got here how marvelous the coast is. I know how amazing California is. So I haven't been surprised by how beautiful it is here, but I have been astonished at how the homeowners, how their houses and how their devotion to the house and the place is so profound, and it has elevated their lives. I've seen such joy, and it makes me excited. A lot of people were, some of them are second home. They're driving up from Los Angeles. They're like, I don't mind the 9 hours. It's okay. And other people left, let's say, the Bay Area, and I was like, you're here all the time. Don't you miss the city? They're like, no. It's you look at
Just look, smell.
So I think it's really been you guys that, going into your world a little bit has really shown me that how a place can be elevated by its people and by its built structures in conjunction with this amazing landscape.
It just sort of took my steam about the individuals that own homes here, many of which we visited. It's like they are curating them. It's not like they've bought them and they're pieces of real estate. They have bought into this place and they feel a commitment. I remember I have a friend that has a really wonderful place in Italy, and when I got there I said, I can't believe you own this place. And he said, oh no, Linda, it owns me. And I think that that is the way that many of the people that have bought these landmark houses here feel, and it was so apparent when they opened them up to us with our muddy shoes, etc. And I really appreciate it. The other thing that as a part of that, and I was thinking about Larry and the sort of ephemeral RSVP cycles, and you look at like the condos as a performance. I mean, that's what he called it, a performance. And I said, but then it's there, and that's it. And then how do you evaluate it once it's there? And I think he saw those individual pieces. They were like a chord in this entire symphony. So you build X here, and then your response is a different chord someplace else. It doesn't. Yes, you maybe rework that some, but it all each decision impacts every other decision, and I think that was his intent both here and in explaining RSVP cycles. And I hadn't gotten it as well. I hadn't really gotten it until this 2 days.
I was taken by the privilege of visiting the insides of so many of your homes, by the nature of the scale and proportion of the architecture that was created for you and around you. These spaces are not about windows, they're about apertures. It was like being in a movie to be in every one of these houses. And everywhere you turned, I laid down on the bed she's sleeping in right now. She wasn't there. And my wife couldn't lay down there because that little slot window is profound. And I think it's universal to the character of the spirit of the architecture that was developed here. That those very human nuances of craft and making, I was taken with, after 50 years by and large of these structures existing in a very harsh, tough climate, that they have been well detailed by their architects, they have been well loved and cared for by their owners, and by and large, they all are showing their age a little bit, just like we all are, but it's the real stuff. It's why I've lived my life trying to do this, and why I set such a high standard when I began. I'm so happy to become part of my life in this way right now.
So anybody want to pick up from that and go on any of those pieces? One of the things that several of you mentioned was needing to find what are the mechanisms through which the new fresh energies can infuse the place and grow from what has already been here. Any more thoughts about what kinds of things could make that happen would be, I think, interesting. Yeah.
I would start off, I think it mentioned, I think a few people mentioned, Chris mentioned, the idea of bringing in a group of students, and I think Will brought up the same idea with having a school here. The sense I'm getting, is that, aside from one of on the obverse point, what I found here, and I think this was also echoed in a couple of the comments, is that a lack of public spaces. That there aren't benches and there aren't little areas to gather, and and I think that's a product of the power of the vision of the houses. In fact, I think at times it works against public space. When you have these amazing private dwellings with these incredibly crafted views, and it's hard to devote your attention to the outside as much. But I think some mechanism to get it's not to start off with perhaps new homes, but perhaps to start off on the landscape and to bring a summer class of students to actually walk Sea Ranch and hike Sea Ranch and camp Sea Ranch and come up with ideas about creating places of gathering, that where people can actually not just encounter each other on a walkway and say hi or stop and stand, but actually where they know that if they go there, there might be other people there. And maybe it's too soon. In the Bay Area we have all these food trucks. They seem to be an amazing way to get people to go somewhere at a certain time. And if maybe, if there was a way to bring in a food truck or two on a certain day, and actually coordinate that with designing a space next to where the food trucks sit, where they park. And so you'd have an area that, let's say on Wednesday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, you can go and you can get an espresso and you can get a taco, and you can sit around, and maybe things will build from there. There'll be a checker tournament that establishes there. You build some, things will happen outdoors. Again, I admit I haven't been here in the famous winds, so maybe this is not as realistic, but then that's also an opportunity to design, barriers for that. So some way to bring in young architects and landscape architects to work toward starting an enhancement of public spaces in the Sea Ranch.
Well, that's an interesting challenge of actually seeing the temporary and we come and we're here only part of the time, but then seeing some institutions that would also be part of the time. One of the things I think we haven't probably communicated enough to you is the amount of activities there are. I mean, not activities of the sort that the resort hotels had, but if I'd given you a back page of the Bulletin, you'd have seen this as a whole page of various meetings that people are having about bridge or bicycle or piloting or the Commons Landscape Committee or etc. So there's a lot going on, but it's true that that there are some places, Del Mar Center, where some people began watching this, are places to go, but there isn't a kind of hangout place. And, I think I'd probably be, somebody will tell me I'm wrong. They know where to hang out.
When it was first described, it was described as building a town. Didn't you say it was like building a little town? Or did you just say community, Tom?
I think I said community, but...
Because it is a kind of a community without a center.
And actually, in one of the last workshops, I failed to mention that one of the things that Larry did, though he was no longer specifically consultant to the development, he was asked 3 times, wasn't it, to come and hold workshops for sea ranchers. And one of the persistent themes that came up in there, with a little product from there, it must be said, was the search for a place that could be more of a center. And that also was part of the initial plans that were made by some of us for the lodge expansion, was to have a little 1-block Main Street with galleries and coffee places and Office Depot and stuff like that. I know Office Depot is already out of sync, but nonetheless, the idea would be some place you could go and get some services, and because you were doing it, you would encounter other people. That's one of the reasons that people have been insistent on keeping the post office. It is one of the places where people come, but since we don't use the post office very much anymore, some other mechanisms are in order, right? Yes?
I wanted to put a plug in a sort of congratulations to Donlyn and the Landscape Commons Committee for...
Talking to Mike.
I wanted to put in a plug for
Yeah, especially now. Well,
for Donlyn and the Landscape Commons Committee. I've gone through the Area 9 booklet. I haven't seen all of the proposals. One of the things that has struck me is that many of the places, the awareness of the coastline, there are places as you go along number 1 and as you're going through
Sea Ranch, where that awareness has been lost in a way that I know that that was one of the driving forces in every decision that Larry made. Along with that, even sort of the small decisions of how the driveway goes in out here and the size of the parking lots. And I just, some of that, I mean, some of the care has been lost in some of the buildings, but I think it's particularly been lost in some of the landscape movements. And I think some of that can be fixed. And by managing the meadows, for one thing, so that you can reestablish in some places better connections to the coastline, strategic developments. I'm dying to see a 100-foot long bench out here where we sat on the asphalt today. But more modest things with plantings as well. I think there's a lot that could be done. And the landscape, your group has started the ball rolling.
And we've done that with the participation of people in the area.
Yeah.
That's been, again, the whole point of the workshop.
And I
They,
think
they
that-
haven't been like Alfred workshops, I have to tell you. But they have been productive, yes.
But it seems that everyone benefits when those improvements are.
Could I ask a question? It is,
Yes, please.
My line of
This is
work.
meant to be a conversation between you. I'm just supposed to get in the way when I have to.
I would like to know what the people who are who live here, love it and are invested in it, I'd like to know what they see as the biggest problems threatening the future of the Sea Ranch. I guess that's a long conversation.
There will be a question section, maybe some of that will leak out at that time.
Okay, you have to keep it suppressed until it is.
Again,
In the workshops that were held before, one of the things that did constantly get mentioned was a concern about it becoming suburban. And there was a list that Larry drew up. Again, Larry was really good at putting together workshops where everybody got involved, and also really good about planting the seeds for what was going to happen in them. But there's a list of things yes and things no. I think we sent you a copy of that. But what he was really talking about, and I think, Linda, you are absolutely right, that the business of not having suburbia meant not having lawns, which meant not having a completely artificial environment that had to then be treated with a lot of artificials to maintain the way it was. What we have now instead is we've continued to have the notion of a native landscape, but we've had to control it because of fire. And so there have been concerns, and one of the things we've often heard in the Commons Landscape workshop, we've heard two kinds of things that started out being really predominant. One was, the amount of vegetation that was growing up and blocking views or changing the whole shape of the landscape. And the other was concerns about fire. There's a very extensive, however, fuels management program, which has been invested in well by the association and is well underway, and is part of what actually gives the force to our Commons Landscape proposals. We try to direct that.
A nice segue here. I just was thinking, right now there is no marker on the highway to tell anybody who happens to just be on the trail from Canada down the coast what this place really is. There is parking provision at the site of your chapel and your fire station. Would that be an interesting place to set up a storyboard that talks and people can stop like a historic marker? You are historic. You have the ability to also qualify for a historic registry site. Forget UNESCO. First start with just protecting it that way. But wouldn't it be great if we had the story of the environment, sustainability, what this place really means, and it doesn't have to be a long marker, and maybe the food trucks can come there a couple days a week, you know? Get a little side thing going, maybe one of you want to run the food trucks, that'd be really great, a little side income for the association, wouldn't hurt. But wouldn't that be nice? Because right now we come into a sign, we don't know if we're there or we've left for the average person, right? And what about a shout out for all you've done and all that this represents? Might be a simple thing and not very expensive to accomplish.
Also, Tom,
Yes,
to
Chris.
get back to what you said about the Main Street, I'd really like to endorse reviving that idea of a kind of short Main Street that spilled down toward the water just north of the lodge, particularly if it could be a vehicle for bringing in some new architectural energy, if you could imagine residential units on the upper floors and retail and some kind of sense of a different dynamic, a different approach to that shared space, a different approach to retail and commercial space here. And also, if you were to think carefully enough about the program and the architects you invited, it could be, kind of injection of new architectural ideas and thinking that was simpatico with, these original ideas.
Yes, Ms.
I can't not advocate for some sort of cultural center or museum, given that my wife is a
A microphone.
I can't not advocate for some sort of cultural center or museum, given my wife is a museum professional and works in that field. But I think a sense I get, I teach history of architecture and art, and I've been doing so for over 25 years. And I'm a big advocate of California, and I want to tell the students, and I go around other places and talk about what makes California, what makes it special and important. And they usually say, well, there are several aspects of California that are noteworthy. The first place in the world to develop an extensive network of freeways, and which we haven't talked about today, but Larry Halpern wrote a book about freeways. He was fascinated with freeways and the view you get from the freeways and how you see it and how you experience it. It's almost like for him it was experiencing the world at 60 miles an hour, like as if you were a fly going around the sculpture and seeing it from all these angles and motions. He was extremely excited about that. So freeways are a big part of California. And I talk about Disneyland, and the theme park as another something California gave to the world, this idea of, which Charles Moore was completely fascinated with. He was fascinated, in fact, with all the small theme parks too, the Nut Tree and the like, the Madonna Inn, all of that. He wrote a great essay in the mid-'60s on that. So, this is something California gave to the world. And then I talk about Sea Ranch. I say there's also architecture. There was Cliff May and the Ranch House, and then there was Sea Ranch. And Sea Ranch is something that you don't find. You never really had that elsewhere in the world, where you took modernist architectural ideas, you took an attitude toward landscape and the environment, and you took a kind of free-form spirit, that California spirit, and you brought them all together and you created this place on the land. And I said, Sea Ranch is a really important place. It's a place that California, that we gave to the world. So I think it makes a lot of sense to have some sort of, more than just a marker, but a museum or a small cultural center that people can stop next to the lodge, and they can act there, and a place that could hold exhibits, it could hold lectures and other events that actually talks about the Sea Ranch idea, how it started, how it's going, where it's going, and communicates that to the world. It's a kind of, I think it's a recognition of how important this place is, and that it's important to tell the rest of the world when they pass by, because I can imagine thousands and thousands of people driving by and not knowing. Just because there's not, like Will says, there's nothing to tell you on the road. But if there was something, if there was just a sign that said, museum, Sea Ranch Museum, I think a lot of people would stop, and I think it would start, and I think then there would be, it's the other thing I wanted to mention, is what I get a sense of is, from talking to people, but also being here, is that it is somewhat insular, and that it would be a way to establish dialogue with the outside, with Sonoma County and Mendocino County, but also with the larger California, and then with the global environment, a way to communicate with them. To tell your story to them, and to have them come to you and give their impressions and talk, and a place for them to stop also and meet people, because I think that would all be really great.
I'm really fascinated by these ideas, and I think it would be great if there was a place for people to meet informally. Also, I'd love it if there was a place to get a cup of coffee where you didn't have to drag up that hill. But honestly, for all of these ideas that we who don't live here are discussing, is there ambivalence on the part of the people who do live here about not being so isolated and being more open up to a general public?
I was about to say that, soon I hope we can open to the discussion. But there definitely is considerable anxiety about, especially hordes of people coming up and down the highway as an image. Not that it's ever really a fact, but as an image. There are some other things that we haven't. I really want to come back. I'm sorry. I really want to come back to have input from the audience. But there are a couple other things that I think have been brought out in this panel that haven't actually been commented on. One is the similarity of the audience here, the age demographic particularly, but not just the age demographic. The business of being a community that has a great lookalike status, and that is actually not opening to the rest of the world in the way that it might, though there's nothing intended or actually in the mechanisms, except maybe price, that are making that happen. It is originally the case that the original layouts had little small lots and great big lots. And that was precisely because it was intended to be a multi-economic status, which unfortunately the economy has made everybody rich. Well, sort of rich. So that is a challenge that has been brought up. If you have any others comments on that, or how to kind of move in any way about that direction. You probably don't.
Would there be right now we look at all the intellectual energy that's just where a lot of you are coming from, San Francisco. You know, what if it becomes a conference retreat space that again serves as a community resource? I mean, this barn could be at the heart of it, but a connected place that people could come, could stay, could network, could be here. Doesn't have to be big, but again, the sort of privilege of ideas infiltrating the community, and you know, for its life to go on, it's going to be very interesting. You know, I don't know how many real estate people are in the audience, where that world is right now, but it seems like there's such hunger in the city, and somebody that lives in, you know, what, 400 square feet in a micro down in San Francisco would be delighted to come and have 400 square feet in the landscape. And wouldn't that be a wonderful energy that could cross back and forth and fit into the scale and the texture and be quite good.
So then we're actually getting some notions about institutional things and programmatic things that could bring new people into this place on a temporary basis, who then might, like so many of the people in this audience would say, they came one day and then they got smitten. And if we actually attracted a larger range of people for a larger range of purposes, that may be something that could begin to instill a dynamic in the community itself. Yeah.
And another thing, that last week I had the privilege of being in Reno, Nevada, at a museum that I'm close to. But what's more important was it was the third triennale, so every 3 years they have a workshop on art plus the environment. Every 3 years, they start working the day it ends and whatever. In the course of 6 years, they have brought the world to this museum because of the conversation and the quality of the subject matter. This intersection between art and environment, and what better place than Sea Ranch to engage that sort of conversation. And every 3 years, it comes up on the cycle that people are talking and thinking about it, and they come, they enjoy, you know, it can be choreographed. Again, there's just this great burgeoning of all kinds of positive things about where it's at. I guess we're going back to the question of the audience. Has Airbnb hit Sea Ranch? Or don't you know? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that has its own pluses and minuses, as we read about every day in the paper, if we read the paper or our website. Lots of new ways to invent this identity.
Yes.
I think a couple of things. One, I think it's important to stress that the opportunity for Sea Ranch is not just about the anniversary. It's not just because it happens to be the 50th year. There are a lot of ways in which this experiment is timely. Again, many of us have touched on that. Can't tell you how many young architects I know are looking carefully at the work of Charles Moore again, and fascinated by it and him and his writing as well as his design work. I think his writing, for those of you who don't know it, holds up exceedingly well. I've been looking at a lot of his writing about Los Angeles, for example, which holds up especially well. But there are a lot of young architects thinking about history again, thinking about vernacular. There's a really interesting conversation beginning to happen about regionalism in this global age. What does that mean? And a lot of young architects are thinking about those questions. Some of the architects I mentioned this morning in my remarks are looking again at some of these vernacular forms and bringing them back in new ways. So I think there are a number of ways in which the time is right to have this conversation about a more forward-looking attitude about the new kinds of design that could be brought here. And then to get back to the question about diversity and bringing new people in, you have to give people more places to come in and experience. So not just houses for rent, but different kinds of ways to experience it, whether that means a hotel or more multifamily or more affordable housing, however that conversation plays out. It has to be, instead of the vast majority of places that people come to experience this landscape being the single family house, there being other options, whether it's retail or hotel or any of the other things that we've talked about, done of course in a sensitive way, and you have to be very careful about it, and the architecture and how it's handled. But if that's the goal, if the goal is to bring a different cross-section of the community into this place and to get them to understand its value and its importance and its history, there have to be more places for them to kind of attach themselves and get a taste of the place.
Well, I think we really need to open up to questions, and so do you want to have your break? We'll have an early break, and then it'll give us more time for questions and discussion afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll break now, and if you could be back in your seats between 10 and after 3 and quarter after 3, we'll have a good long time for questions. Thank you. Welcome back. I think there are actually a few seats up front, partly because our speakers are up on the stage, so if some of you are really stuck back there and want to come forward, there seem to be a couple of seats up here. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cities up here, so probably maybe more. I was asked, I don't think we need to close the doors for both of them. We can leave one open. I think the air would be nice. Yeah, thanks. Because at this point, we don't need this slide. I was asked to mention that, well, I did mention that we have the barn book for sale at the back. We also have the proceedings of Larry Halpern's third workshop here at the Sea Ranch, which were discussed quite a bit by the speakers, and the proceedings from Larry's last workshop were unpublished at the time of his death, and when we did a memorial for Larry, we raised money from Sea Ranchers to actually publish these, and so it's wonderful. And that is also for sale at the back tables, so just wanted to mention that. Okay. Something came loose. Oh, now it's on again. What? Off again. Well, Mercury is retrograde. It's that's what kept reminding me. So now it's on again. Oh. Is it working? Now it's working, but we'll see for how long.
Having some weird power issues.
Leave it.
Doesn't sound good. I smell ozone.
It's I think it's the barn. So is it working now? See how long it keeps working. It's working, it's working, it's working. So I'm just going to start talking. If you would like to ask a question of the panel, please line up at the floor mic on your right, over there. And again, keep in mind that the audio from today's program will be posted on the Sea Ranch website, and video will be available as well. And I wanted to mention that we now have about 250 people with us online, so the audience is growing for this fascinating program. As I mentioned earlier, in February, the association will be organizing a member workshop where we can discuss and apply our speakers' thinking to our vision of changing Sea Ranch. Today, therefore, I ask that you frame your questions as two questions, true questions to the panel, not statements of your own experience or observation. Please limit your questions to 1 minute and wait to ask another until after everyone who wishes to ask a question has had a turn. And do give your name, because we may not be able to get you in our web feed. I mean, I don't think we can get all of us in, so we may not see you, but it'd be nice to know your name. So we have scheduled an hour, and we'll go until 4:15 or until there are no more questions, whichever comes first. I'd like to begin actually by asking a question of the audience. How many people in the audience are not sea ranchers? If you could raise your hands so we could see. Oh, there are actually quite a few. Wow. Yeah, some. Okay, put your hands down. How many are what Rob calls locals, from our local area, but not a sea rancher? There's Jake. Okay, well, Jake, we're paying you to be here, please. So that's kind of interesting. I find that very interesting because we did at the beginning advertise this in the ICO. It very quickly filled up, so we didn't advertise it again exactly, except to have it in the calendar in a very minimal way. But it strikes me it might be interesting to do something like this across the river, because one thing that I think our speakers, well, there's no way they would be aware of it because we had so little time to show them around the Sea Ranch. We're actually part of a larger community which includes Gualala across the river. We're very, very closely tied with them. And in fact, we have a wonderful arts center there, right across the river. It's a beautiful setting and built in, not, I wouldn't say large part, but it would not have happened without the sea ranchers who worked on it and gave their volunteer time. And I'm just thinking it might be quite interesting to do something like this there. And, we would necessarily get opinions, broader. And also, Gualala and our surrounding area is quite diverse. We couldn't ask for more. And so, we might look closer to home. So, I guess, there's no way you would have said that because you weren't aware of the bigger picture. But I know that there are many in the audience who want to make this point, so I thought I would make it before I asked for questions from the audience. So, first question.
I'm Richard Carlisle, civil engineer and surveyor, and I spent 50 years on the Sea Ranch. I was lucky enough to be a young engineer 50 years ago and trail behind all these wonderful designers, looking at their sketches and trying to make it work from an engineering surveying standpoint. So I have as Donlyn knows, I have 100 stories to tell, but I do have one that just knocks my socks off.
But is it a question, Richard?
There is a question at the end.
Okay. Put that lilt at the end, okay.
But I have to lead into this. I have a son that lives in Milan, Italy, my wife and I went over to visit him. This is 12 years ago. And he was lucky enough to get us a villa on Lago Maggiore. And the local architects, the Italian, the equivalent to the AIA, Italian architects were doing a tour of villas on Lago Maggiore. And they had occupied one of them. And I said, I gotta get over there and look at that one, because that has a lot of stuff in it probably. So I went over there, got on the bottom, and they said, well, we're busy right now, we can't do that, but you can go ahead and look upstairs in the upper floor of the villa. I was blown away.
Okay, Richard, we need your question, because you're already over time.
Square footage of that was an exhibit of the Sea Ranch.
Oh,
All done in design, all done with models, studies,
and
more than I'd ever seen in 50 years, all in Italian. So my question is, how do the world is out there studying the Sea Ranch. Believe me, this was students and the Italian architects. How do we enhance what you have all said, that the world, how do we bring the students in? How do we bring studies? How do we create a center here where we can show what wonderful things have happened here?
Okay, thanks, good question. Does anybody have any concrete ideas? I know this is kind of your idea. Are your mics working? No? Yeah, well, that one is.
Whoever's taking the mic answers.
This is not my idea, this is what others on the panel have said, but I think you should establish a relationship, if the community cares, with an architecture school and begin to try to do a summer program here. I think that's one of the best ideas I've heard today. And one of them should be about using the students to take inventories and surveys on which you would base, future planning and conversation.
Richard, I want to shake your hand because I have his name right here. I heard rumor he was going to be here. So thank you for being sympathetic, because it's not just the great landscape architects, civil engineer with his sensibility and energy I was told about. So that's great. But back to this idea of the sort of involvement, this idea of surveys. You have an empty building up by the airport. Walked that building 2 days ago at breakfast when we did go up to the little pastry shop up there. It could provide lodging, it could provide studios, it could be a great indoor-outdoor thing. So you have an armature for potential, and we have talked to some of the people from Cal. There's other places to reach. Cal's an easy reach, Woodbury's an easy reach. I think you can make this happen with very little downside to yourself and really start the conversation, and everybody could get involved. I mean, with making this mapping and making these things at the start, but then just getting into it. I had another one of your citizens come up to me and say, what about co-housing? You know anything about that? Would that be good? Talk about a wonderful continuation of what happened at Condominium 1. It doesn't have to be a condominium. What about a co-housing thing where, again, you get a whole other thing working? It's a perfect idea.
I have to say, though, a couple people came up, is this working? A couple people came up to me during the break and said that, they like things the way they are. Maybe they didn't want to be in a fishbowl and have, as one person put it to me, tour buses of visitors from the outside world coming to a museum. So I think there is clearly some resistance to these ideas, and for good reason. I mean, the status quo here is extraordinarily beautiful, but I think what you have to remember, and what we've been trying to talk about in looking back to the origins of this place, is that this place worked not just because it's so rooted to the landscape, but because it brought in ideas that were absolutely current from all over the world, and the architects who helped found this place, and the landscape architects were really thinking about a dialogue between those larger ideas that were in the air in the 1960s and this specific place and its landscape. And I think if your concern is, as is natural and as happens in beautiful places all over the world, how to protect it, then you begin to need to worry about provincialism and protecting it so much that these new ideas can't come in, and it becomes, as others have said, a kind of hermetic place or an insular place. And so striking that balance, I understand how difficult that is politically, but I think you need to be always thinking about ways to let some of that outside air and some of those outside ideas in without, of course, spoiling the original sort of ideals of the place.
Very good point. Anyone else? Thank you for a good question. Carol and Andre.
I have a comment and a question. You asked what people in the audience thought the biggest problem is with the Sea Ranch. And my guess is it's very different for all of us, particularly for full-timers versus part-timers. So I'm a full-timer, and this is the only place I've ever lived where you basically pray for a heart attack and to just drop dead at some point. Well, because there's no health care, and I don't want to move to Panorama or wherever people move to. So, I also am on the board of a seniors organization which runs for 60 miles up and down the
Coastal
coast.
Seniors.
And we think all the time about aging in place and about having senior housing where you might be able to walk to a little village that had walking paths and so on. So, do you guys have any ideas on how to do that? Anybody want to throw in your architecture skills or your building skills and help us do that? How would that happen?
I think that's part of the thing that we're trying not to tell anybody here what to do, but I think what all of us think is that if people, what?
We'll do it. But we'll do it.
But we'll do it anyway. No, but if you start by bringing in people to take, and young people are the perfect people, and students are perfect, with some knowledge to begin to survey and find out about these kinds of needs. And somebody came up to me and said, almost like you need a demographer here too, to really understand that. And the other thing, which I think Chris said, is why not begin to bring in some of the best minds in architecture today in the way that the best minds in architecture 50 years ago came and created this place, to come in and begin to listen to all of you and offer some potential solutions. Talk is not entirely free, but it's a start.
But in terms of aging in place, I was really struck a few times when we were taking the tour with Donlyn that he said, there didn't used to be a handrail here. We didn't think about handrails. This was a place that was created by young people, really. Young architects and landscape architects who weren't necessarily thinking about that. And we sometimes forget now that we're 50 years down the line, but they were thinking forward rather than thinking about those questions. So I can see that they're really pressing going forward. And I wish you luck in grappling with those.
Yeah, thank you.
Harrison Fricker.
Yes. So I've been very impressed with the talk about what to do about the future here. And I have two themes that I'd like to have the panel talk about. The first one has to do with what I think Larry's gift was besides the plan and the ideas behind the plan. When I got here as the dean of the college in '96 of environmental design at Berkeley, Walter Hood and I came to one of these road workshops that Larry gave to the landscape students in the building. And there were some things that happened that were amazing. We were taken to one of these places, and Larry asked us to draw what we heard, to draw what we smelled, to draw what we could touch, and then he asked us to draw the process that made this place. And there's incredible wisdom in that for the landscape committee. Because what's special about this place is its way it connects us to our sensory being, much more than the visual. The smell, I walked here this morning, the changes that take place along the coast, it is really transformative. That's what this place gives us. And the architecture that captures that then And the architecture that captures that in the future is what's going to, I think, stimulate the next generation. We even see little ghosts of it happening already. So that's one thing that I felt was undersold this morning. The second thing is everybody's talked about sustainability. And we have to be honest. This is not a sustainable community. Fundamentally, it is a cul-de-sac suburban community done in tremendous sensitivity with nature. But you get in your car to go anywhere, and you can't ride your bike.
So Harrison, what's your question?
So my question is, in the next 50 years, how are we going to make it sustainable?
I'd like to just start off by, I agree with Harrison in terms of, the actual layout. When you look back to when Larry Halpern was here in the early 1960s, this was an era when people didn't think about the kind of problems we're facing now. There wasn't a worry that if you drive too much, you're going to be sending hydrocarbons into the air. There was no concept of that. And so he did design it, the way everything was designed in California in the early 1960s, with cul-de-sacs and dispersed housing and occupying, it's amazing to me how much of the land is occupied by housing, the footprint is occupied by housing, as compared to if you're built a little higher or denser. Frankly, I don't think much can be done with the plan at this point. That would be a very radical idea to actually start transforming the plan, but I think there could be a second plan layered onto the first plan. In other words, there are sites that are strategically located, either by the lodge or by the rec centers or by the airfield, where you could introduce much higher densities and you could create walking communities. And in other words, places where people don't have to get in their car to do everything, that they could walk to get, there could be a store, they could walk to get groceries, they could walk to the swimming pool, they would be able to get out of the car and not use the car as much. So my sense is there would have to be that, what I think a lot of people have been saying here, a layer of thinking about the Sea Ranch, and it makes so much sense to use architecture students and to do that because they're free and they're young and they think really differently, and it would be I think you guys would be so invigorated to have like a group of them here for a summer. It would just be amazing, and to ask them just to come up with these ideas. Well, how could we plan for the future so that the community could become more sustainable over time? And then, could we perhaps transform some of the areas that exist? Give them the parameters about how to do it, and then have a discussion with them at the end when they present their work. I think it would be very inspiring because, I think what was coming up in the last couple of questions is the fact that when I think what attracted all of you here was that this was not your everyday community. This was special. There was something different about Sea Ranch. And it did have an environmental aspect, and it did have an artistic, architectural aspect. It wasn't every resort community. It was something very different. The question is, how do you keep that? You can't just keep that based on the legacy, because the legacy is not going to sustain it. It's going to, and especially over time. Larry Halpern died a few years ago. That takes away one voice. I mean, you're going to. Those early voices can't do it alone, and I think there's a time to bring in some new voices to start a process of keeping a sense of the history and the reason you came here. What was the attraction? But you have to accept that it has to change, that the vision can't stay exactly the same. It just can't. Nothing does in this world. And the things that do in this world become a little bit staid. Not to say it's becoming staid, but anything that doesn't have a mechanism to grow and change and bring in new opinions and new voices is going to do that. And, we wouldn't have thought 50 years about sustainability the way we're doing now. We had thought about pollution. That was the big buzzword 50 years ago. The earth is getting polluted, the air and water, which still have tremendous problems. But the issues now are, as we all know, much broader. They involve the very way we live, right? Our daily routines. We have to change our daily routines. We all know this. I think about this every time I get in an airplane. We all have to do this. So And my students are so aware of it. I mean, they don't want to even get driver's licenses. I mean, they're just half of them. They're like, we don't need to drive. We don't want to drive. And they just, so I think if there's one idea that comes out of today, which I think has been mentioned by a lot of the speakers, is to arrange some way, and students can actually, they can sleep, and I had them on a tour, and they were sleeping 4 in a room. They're very flexible. So you don't have to worry about the accommodations as much as with us. You know, we're finicky and difficult. But I think a way, if there could be a summer institute, like run through one of the local architecture schools or a couple of the architecture schools, and bring a group of students and pose these fundamental questions about density, about sustainability, about public, relationships to the external world, about legacy, and pose those questions and ask them to come up with some ideas. That would be a tremendous outcome. Because these are real issues.
Thank you, Mitchell.
Quickly, I was going to say that the challenge here is, surprisingly enough, the same challenge that Los Angeles writ large is struggling with right now, which is how to retrofit an essentially suburban, car-dominated, single-family dominated landscape for a different future. And as much as I love the idea of bringing students here, which I think could be tremendously helpful, what really struck me about Linda's presentation was the absolute rigor with which these people, particularly Larry Hawthorne, looked at this landscape. And I think what's needed now is the same kind of professional rigor looking at these problems anew with the same ambition to tackle the next 50 years. And it's not just about tweaks here or there. In some ways, it's a kind of fundamental reassessment of what this place is for, how people live here, what kind of people are attracted here, what kinds of architecture is built here, and so forth. And I think there needs to be a really rigorous conversation and examination of that set of questions.
Yeah, and actually those two are not in conflict, because I can imagine an international program where you could bring in an internationally experienced, knowledgeable, rigorous architect to do a workshop with students from one of the area, or more than one. You could have, students could apply, and so you could actually combine those two.
The reason I was just advocating the students first is because I think what I think needs to happen is a lot of thinking before you hire that person. What kind of person you need to, if you're eventually that person would get hired, that would actually engage someone. There needs to be a lot of discussion about, well, what do we actually, think.
So research needs to be done first.
I think a lot of research needs to be done before you get to that point, because that's a big moment to get another Larry Halpern in here. I mean, there are people like him in the world who are thinking about these things, but it would be good to figure things out.
You could have a two-pronged process, it strikes me. And the other thing is, this is also really ripe once you get more information, knowledge, and you begin to develop some ideas of direction. Boy, is this right for an international design competition? And then you get a whole lot more free ideas. You get somewhat free. I mean, you've got to pay people to be in a competition, but you could get some really provocative ideas and maybe come up with a plan.
I will say I do not support a competition. We need people that will listen to you, that are professionals, guiding students, working, whether it be their professors or other professionals. There has to be a whole database, because you don't know how good or bad you are until you ask probably tough questions that nobody wants to ask. Develop a survey to analyze the situation as it exists and really find the problems, just as Larry did when he hit the site. I mean, you had this passionate, crazy guy that was sleeping on beaches here for 2 years before he put a pencil to paper. He was doing his sketchbooks, he was looking at this thing. You need that passion. You won't get it from a competition. It's not about making somebody famous because they came here, and worked on the master. We want somebody that really believes in your place. Carefully analyze where that is. Find that sort of soul to it.
But you also need someone who's of the age that Larry was when he did it.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
I mean,
how old was he? How old was Larry when he?
29, 30, 34? What?
Down speaking to the
a young man. Yeah, you were all that way.
Yeah, they were all young.
We all were once. 35.
Well, Larry must have been 45, I think.
Linda was now, yeah.
His 40s,
45, 45.
45, yeah.
That's when you practice enough that you can really lead.
Okay, well, good question, Harrison. That was good. Okay. And please give your name.
Hi, my name is Miranda Jewell. I should start by saying that I'm a complete newbie here at Sea Ranch. My husband and I bought a place this past summer, and we're part-timers. And I just want to reassure you that there is a question at the end. We live in Berkeley most of the time, and in Berkeley we have farmers markets and lots of places to meet people, lots of places to get coffee, good coffee, wonderful shops and restaurants and, you know, many versions in Main Street and whatnot. That's not why we're here at Sea Ranch. And we don't come from a design or architecture background. We came here for the unbuilt environment. We came here for lack of a better word, what people used to refer to as nature. And for the solitude and quiet and things that the previous question was talking about, the way the air smells in the morning or in the evening when the sun is going down. And the little that I know about Sea Ranch and that I've learned over the past year is that you know, it's not status quo, but it is a deep attachment to in what is becoming, in a large part of the world, a disappearing landscape, and the way in which the people who founded Sea Ranch got it right, as many of you point out. So, but I understand the, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but the comments you were making about the need for more energy and more conversation about the experience at Sea Ranch, and I'm wondering if as non-design professionals you can suggest ways to do that, which is not just bring in architecture students or bring in designers and people who will help you think about what kind of buildings to build, but maybe focusing on the issue of sustainability, which is a critical one for our time and which, you know, was the impetus for a lot of the design 50 years ago. Maybe the way is not to look forward into the tech future, but to look back. I would be very interested in hearing from the wisdom of, for instance, talking about diversity, Native American groups there is a long tradition which goes back more than 50 years about sustainability. And so conversations at a very high level, but with a broader diversity of people than architects and academia.
That's a good, very good, whatever it was, question, comment. Does anybody have a response?
Well, I would say that related to that is the set of workshops that Harrison was referring to that actually were designed, as was Anna's much shorter one, for the specific purpose of getting people to pay more attention to what was around them, to try to draw more experience out of what was around them, and that to have us have more programs where we accept that in fact we're all slightly diminished in our awareness of what's happening in the environment, and can increase that so as to increase the way in which we use the place, so other people can come and use that to have a richer set of experiences. And then those become part of what it takes. One of the things it takes to be sustainable is for people to love it, and to get to know it, and to realize that they're really a part of something larger. And that realization, I think, is something we ought to continue to be providing, and that there are steps being taken towards that. But the prod to do that in a more expansive way is a good one.
I'd just like to say, I've just read not nearly as much as I think a lot of other people on the panel, but Larry and Anna Halpern were very involved in the early days, aren't I right, Donlyn, with the Native American
Yes,
community
they
that was still
continue
here?
to.
Still are. Hannah still is.
And that was very much part of the early days. So there's a real history with that here,
Yeah.
and I think you make an excellent point. The other point I'd just like to make is that it's a little bit of a defense of the profession of architecture, and I'm not an architect, but I do think architecture and design are a way of looking at the world to think about the world and think about a very wide range of issues. And I would never say that anybody should only bring in architects, but I think the idea of bringing in a broad range of thinkers who think about this kind of place, and it could include design students, it could not, but some of the best, design problems today are done by teams that involve people from design, but also people from other professions, geographers, obviously here, people who might be experts in the environment and sustainability, a whole kind of team approach. Not to come in and say you should build a lot more buildings, but to come in and, as I think we've all been saying, and listen. And the idea of sustainability is not just to make things green, but as Donlyn was saying, it's to extend the life of this community, not exactly as it's always been, but kind of based on the principles in which it was founded. And I think that takes, a tremendous amount of soul-searching, planning, and thinking going forward.
I think it's a great, I just want to caution, we bring up, learning from the past and learning from the Native American peoples who lived in this region, but I think I want to caution that, we have to think about the way we live, the infrastructure we rely on, or infrastructures that make our lives possible. The water systems, the gasoline and electric power grids, the internet cables and telephone cables. The way we live, the environment we live in is wholly artificial. No matter how much we think we're living in this natural place. I wonder how many of you live without this infrastructure, forsake the infrastructure entirely, and get here independent of gasoline and, our freeways and, have illumination independent of the power grid and, independent of the communication systems and the information systems. What needs to be done is thinking, how do we take this infrastructure that supports this artificial life in this beautiful place? Which is, if you think about it, one of the points I didn't make this morning that I could have made was that resort communities and resorts didn't start until the 18th century because it wasn't safe. The countryside was dangerous in most of the world. It was unpatrolled. There were bandits, brigands. It sounds gross, but it was true. You didn't go out at night. You didn't go through the forest, and people feared nature. In general, nature was seen kind of as a scary thing. And it really was the modernization and development of modern infrastructure that allowed nature to become pacified to the extent to which we could inhabit it and enjoy it. So our whole idea of aesthetic contemplation in a beautiful place like Sea Ranch is made possible by modern infrastructure that allows the safety and all the other artificial conveniences. It's the truth. It was very different when the Native American people lived here and there were grizzly bears everywhere. Think about it, you would have not gone out of your house alone ever. You would have gone out at certain times, you would have known when to avoid them. There were there were a whole set of dangers in countryside. So we need, but I think we forget that. We think, we're living here and it's peaceful and it's quiet. Well, it's only living here peaceful and quiet because you're part of this vast system of global, technological advances. And then, I guess what we're advocating overall is that one needs to just start talking and thinking about that. And think, well, are there ways within those systems to actually lessen the load? But one has to first be aware of the fact that we're connected. This is not an unconnected place. This is a very linked place. And the Native American cultures that preceded us 250 years ago were not. They were dependent on the land in a very different way than we are. And they had a very different, so we can learn from them to some extent. But it's not probably the direction we're going to go fully unless we understand the way they lived and the way we live, and then start to say, well, what
You know, how can we lighten our load? Where are the places we can lighten our load? Because we have to begin with where we're at. And I think a lot of what was happening in the early 60s with Larry Halpin and others was a bit romantic and a little fantastical. You know, people were thinking, well, we can actually reject modern civilization and go back to the land and live that way. And we know what happened with most of the communal experiments in Northern California. They didn't last, they didn't work, because they weren't aware of the degree of dependence and interrelationship with cities, with capitalism, with political structures. So if it's done today, it's going to be done differently. There's going to be a different awareness than you had in the early 1960s. I think a much more sanguine awareness of how you can create a wonderful creative place, but not be as, you know, almost kind of joyfully naive the way Larry was able to be in 1963. That is not possible today. We know too much about our interweavings, and we know too much about the attempts, like I just said, to just totally break away and do it on your own. It just doesn't work, it doesn't happen. So that's why we're encouraging discussion and thought. It takes so much to start learning about all these systems and the intertwining of the systems with Sea Ranch in order to even begin to understand how can we lighten the load we place upon the earth.
Thank you very much, Mitchell.
Quickly along those lines, I think this idea, this landscape is unbuilt, as you put it in that good question, or unspoiled, is an illusion produced by very good design. And this is a highly designed and engineered landscape that produces the illusion through its intelligence of being untouched or unspoiled. And that's just to follow those points that you made, which are, I think, really good ones.
To follow on that one more step very quickly, you talked about the lightening the load. You know, the most quoted phrase about Sea Ranch is living lightly on the land. In the last 10 years or so, I argued with Larry that we really needed to change that from living on the land to living with the land. Yeah. That we are a part of it, and that we have to see it that way, not just imagine we're settling down on it. He didn't disagree, but he never changed the title.
Okay, George, thank you.
Asking for your comments. We're celebrating the 50th year of mid-century of Sea Ranch, and today we've seen wonderful images and climbing things which were initially started 50 years ago. And the images that we've seen, we've been looking at up here, are those initial buildings which were designed for this place, etc. Time has been going on, a lot of construction has been going on, and it's moved up the coast. And I just wonder what your honest opinion is of how that, how we've moved up through the iconic structures up to what we do and living on the land right now. And I trust you've had a chance to look at what's been developed from that early start. And I just wonder what you think about how it's going at this time, and are we keeping those ideas close?
Great question. Linda.
Okay, I'll be the one to
Speaking
stick
to
my
my
neck out here because I'll be saying what we've all been talking about. And that is, I have to say there were places up in the north end of Sea Ranch where I would look around and I could be in Contra Costa County in suburban suburban East Bay. And I think that's unfortunate. That's an extreme statement. But I think part of it has to do with the subtlety of some of the things I showed, how roads were put in, how houses were sited, how the loss of the connection to from the meadows down to where the edge was. So George, wherever you went, it's not what it was. I mean, there's a real difference from the south end as you move up to the north. That said, there are many, in any of those places, there are many gorgeous, wonderful spots where one can appreciate what it means to be a sea ranch. They are much less in number. And I don't think it had to be because it's not about the number of units, the kinds of things that have been talked about. It could have been the same number of people, but with less grandiose square footage, etc., and just the subtlety of how places were sited, and that includes beyond just there's some wonderful individual buildings up there, but it has more to do with the loss of quality, I would say, in the development of how roads were placed, how things were graded, this very artificial landscape in a way which respected, it was about designing with this place and what it was. And I think that's what Larry was about, that's what McCard was about, that was what all of the leaders of that era, they were saying, we've got to understand how a landscape works in order that we can insert ourselves, because we're inserting ourselves anyway. But we want to insert ourselves understanding the implications of how we do it and hold on to as much as we can of that wonderful experience that may exist in a place that does exist in a place like this. But it's definitely been lost. A lot of it has been lost as you move north, I think. And I think I'm speaking for all of my colleagues, because this has been a constant conversation as we've been moving around. Anyone want to argue with me?
Again, it's probably a sore subject to bring up, but when was the last time Larry was not your neighbor, but was your landscape architect? When was he dismissed by the developer?
Oh, long ago.
Yes.
69.
Yeah.
69.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so there's 40 years where the pattern has not relied on that genius that formed it. So we have 10 years of things we love so dearly, and again, you know, there is exactly what you were saying. We went for a walk at lunch along this edge right now. We could have been anywhere else I've ever been on the planet, not a sea ranch.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, in some ways, it's kind of a miracle. It's continued as well as it has. I mean, sure, it sort of fell apart, you know, at a certain point, but not totally. And people still seem to have the same sentiments about it that we can return to and build on, so.
Yeah,
Because all those many of those wonderful spots have not been lost.
and I would actually say that at this point, our charge is to figure out how to make wonderful places out of what's here, not to worry what might have happened.
Yeah.
And so that's actually what we've been trying to do with the Commons Landscape Committee, is to get in and understand what landscape there really is here, and then how to make further advantage of that. I'm not saying we're there yet, and I'm not disputing the idea for more vigorous examination of the landscape than we've been doing through these workshops and our vision analyses. But it seems to me the challenge for the future is not one of wondering why it didn't happen, but of saying, okay, now what can we do from here? And finding different ways of institutionally connecting with it, different kinds of programs, different ways of also imagining how one could infill. We are all afraid to think about that because it violates the existing plan. But I think it's absolutely right that we have to face the issue of what would be the possibilities for seeing this place expanded in a different way, and what are the ways of using it in different ways. One of the problems we have is that half of it is unoccupied half of the time, which is not very sustainable use of resources. And my piece is too. So I'm not casting aspersions. It's a fundamental issue of resource utilization. If we use what it is that we have to its full, that would be already a major step towards a more sustainable future.
Okay, have another question? Oh, David, Little John. Okay, could somebody get the mic down to David's level? Okay. I should say up to David's level.
Got me?
All right.
I don't know how many of you looked at the book that Jackie mentioned called The Barn, which is a great book about
George
this very
Holmes
building.
brought some up here.
And one of the things that totally flabbergasted me as I read that was that it took 10 years to get this building in semi-ruin, put back into shape so it could be used. And much of that time was spent fighting with the community that didn't want anything to be here. They didn't want any gatherings, they didn't want any public meetings, they didn't want anything changed. They were worried about the traffic, they were worried about the parking, they were worried about the bright lights of people coming here to a building that holds about 150, 200 people and now cannot be used at night at all. If they had that much trouble getting this building put back together, the things I've heard today, a conference center, an education establishment by the airport, a Main Street north of the lodge, the fight they're having now about trying to double the size of the lodge. They probably had a fight about moving the golf course from 9 to 18 holes. I mean, anytime anybody has tried to add anything, the Verdant View project, where somebody wants to add a grocery and general store to the lumber yard and the TSRA building and the fire, I don't know what else is up there, but that's semi-zoned for business, but it's never been used for it, except for the lumber yard. And here, these phenomenal buildings that Christopher showed us, they're going to pass the design committee?
That's a good question.
Are any of these things going to be approved by a population that is not going to get any younger and probably not much more forward-seeing and non-conservative as far as ski rent? They like ski rent, as we heard, the way it was when they moved in. They liked it when they read about it for the first time. They don't want a grocery store. They don't want a coffee shop. They don't want a clinic. God knows they don't want a church or school. God knows. They don't want a dormitory for students. They don't want a conference center. Think what that would do to them. So all of these great ideas have this great wall of Sonoma County fighting them. And I don't see, speaking just reasonably politically, how any of these great ideas are going to get past the current population, the current TSRA, or the current design committee. If anybody has an idea, maybe a revolution where you they were very fun to listen to, but I kept writing in my notes, never happened. Never happened.
I wanted to say, I've been, living in this San Francisco Bay Area. I was going to wonder how many of those people were from Berkeley or from San Francisco, because we are, I wrote an article about over 10 years ago, San Francisco in an age of reaction. And the Bay Area has been one of the most architecturally unfriendly places starting in the 80s. I actually helped create that, unfortunately, because I worked on the downtown plan for San Francisco. I wrote the preservation guidelines and preserved 500 some odd buildings. It was a great thing at that time because we were tearing down a lot of buildings and there was a real fear we were going to lose San Francisco. And what we ended up doing is for a while, we fossilized San Francisco. We preserved it so much that we were scared of anything. And you mentioned a building that's going to shade another building, oh my God, I'm going to lose sunlight. A building that's going to block part of view, no. Any parking, all the issues you bring up are totally mirrored by what happened in the Bay Area. And what I wanted to say is it's changing. It is changing now in the Bay Area. San Francisco is a different place than it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. There is a much more receptivity because of issues of global climate change, because of a fascination with design, because of a fascination with technology. You're getting a population, a change in attitude. It's taking a long time, but it's happening. And even Berkeley, which is going to be voting again, they're fighting about an increased density downtown Berkeley. And it's been a big struggle. I'm sure Linda's been following it, and Harrison and others. We've been arguing, God, if you can't build a 5-story buildings along San Pablo Avenue or University Avenue, where are you going to build them? And people say, well, it's not our Berkeley. That's not the way Berkeley has been. And it's ironic because Berkeley, we saw earlier slides today as the leading the flag for change in 1964. and then becoming reactionary toward change by the 80s. So I'm seeing a change in both in San Francisco. I live in Oakland. We're seeing a bit of a change. And what brought about the change, I'll end on this, was a new young architects coming in and doing works that people went, wow, those are kind of amazing. I think the De Young Museum is a great example. I'm sure a lot of you have been to the De Young Museum. I served pro bono I went to about 15 community meetings throughout San Francisco. And people would say, there's a tower and we can see it. And I was like, well, since time immemorial, towers have been places that you can see. Kind of the idea of a tower. And they were like, well, we don't like a tower then. Conversations like that. But then it got built, and it and a number of other buildings got built, and the attitude, people were like, wow, we kind of like the De Young. It's kind of cool looking. It's kind of an amazing building. We can have some more of those, and you really have a different climate now. And it really took a few examples of buildings that are really amazing, and I think that's what could happen here too, maybe. Like, either, build, you just experiment with how it can happen, but I think what you're saying is, I've lived it, I'm telling you, and I know.
I think that your question is the key question. I think you've not just described San Francisco, you've described the entire west side of Los Angeles, for that matter, in terms of attitude towards new construction and change. So this is not a conversation that's unique to the Sea Ranch. I hope that I and others made clear that we understand we're not under any illusions about the difficulty, particularly in connection with design review, of bringing in some of these more forward-looking buildings. I think there is potential in the short term, as we wait for the kind of longer-term shift of attitude, which I think will happen here as well, that a series of small houses could operate as Trojan horses and could sneak in some interesting ideas under cover of a Sea Ranch vernacular and a kind of architectural palette that is acceptable to people if done in the right way, and the right architect is in charge. And I think over time that could begin to plant the seeds for a new appreciation for something that is more forward-looking. But look, none of us is under any illusions about how difficult this is politically. But I also think that it's a debate that's happening all over the place, not just in communities that are usually.
I love what you said about architecture, Chris, but you also said small houses, and I think the whole idea of size is a tremendous problem here and elsewhere. And I think I remember coming out to review the De Young and thinking, I can't believe there's a building like this coming up in Stockfield, San Francisco. You're right, I remember the whole thing. Coming from New York with my Eastern viewpoint again. But the fact of the matter, the other force that's completely driving San Francisco today are soaring real estate values. And, that's a big issue here too. I mean, you've got people who want to protect what they have. You've got, why would you build a small house and sell it when you could build a big house and something,
But if you can legislate everything, if you can legislate, the design and the color of the shingles and the stain, no, but you can legislate size too. I mean, there are things that you control. Design review doesn't just mean the architectural style, it can mean the size, it can mean all of those things. So there's ways to think about, constraint can be defined in a number of ways. I mean, constraint can be in what kind of covering or what kind of plants you can put outside your house. It can also be how many square feet you can build. So, yeah.
I would just say that with all due respect to David, and I have huge respect for David and for the article that has just been published about the Sea Ranch on the Architectural Record website yesterday. And speaking of the Architectural Record being the record, I think he and others are mischaracterizing the situation. I mean, you went from the Barn book and that incredible controversy many years ago, which was a controversy, but not all the community was opposed to it. It was some of the community that were opposed. It was, you characterized it in very large, broad statements of they wanted this, or they wouldn't have this, or they won't. And that's not where we are. And I don't think that where we are either is that the design community is unwilling to consider interesting and suggestive projects. In fact, in my own view anyway, we've published several of them. The design review has passed in the book, and there are others that we didn't. And so, yes, all things are political. Politics is always difficult, but I do not feel comfortable with accepting the characterization of this as a completely negative community towards change. Now, I may be wrong. I may be inherently positive towards what things might be, which would be another bias. But I don't think the situation is quite as you describe it, and I just wanted to get that on the record.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question, a real question. Thanks, Steve. Okay, another question.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Abel. I'm a civil engineer and I practice structural engineering in San Francisco, right by the DeYoung Museum. And I live and work there, but my parents have a home here. They live here full time. It's the bunker with the addition up in the forest that you guys saw yesterday on the tour. But anyway, I'm a long-time architectural record subscriber, but I happened to read the Jewell article on Ramirez residence, and I found it really refreshing and appropriate. And so I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on the broadening of material use and textures in the built environment within Sea Ranch.
Seeing I've had the privilege of being the house guest with my wife, I find it totally refreshing. Again, it meets all the rules. It is about the nature, about the textures. It's about how it weathers, how it conforms in many different ways. It's using the technology of today in glass and detailing and other things. And I find it really refreshing. Like I said, that gives me great optimism and gives me great optimism about the future. They are willing to look at things differently. Did get through, and I heard the Ramirez say it wasn't all that challenged. It was very collegial.
I think it sounds like the design committee is very increasingly open here. I think one of the problems with design committees, and you have to have them in a place like this if you want to maintain some kind of integrity, but it gets to be a sort of check the box thing. You know, will it weather? Is it gray? Is it, you know, and it makes it easy for houses to slide in that maybe they check the boxes, but they're really not. The architecture is not of very high quality, and I think that's one of the things. It's not just the siting of it, of some of these houses, as Linda was suggesting, but it's part of what's disappointing for some of us who took this walk today at lunch, for example. So I think that there's a way if you really want your design committee, as I think it is, sounds like it is, to really be open exactly to what you're saying, to different materials and different ideas, but that reflect the spirit of what Sea Ranch has been and what it wants to be going forward.
One last comment. One of the reasons for the success is the original CC&Rs require that there are design professionals on that committee. They are that group. That makes a great difference. So it doesn't become so much about I like, I don't like, but it becomes a really good critical professional critique. That's to your credit.
Okay, I am mindful of the time. We're actually, at the time we said we were going to stop, but I see at least 2 questions here. It's a little clear. So if you don't mind, I'd like to allow 2 more questions, and then we can retire. If you can't stand it, go out. So, Debbie. Debbie Tyler.
I'm Debbie Tyler. I'm a full-time resident, past board member at Sea Ranch, and I have a very general question. It's kind of my observation that if a place becomes well-known and popular and successful financially, the values go up, and the things that brought people there to begin with begin to disappear. And what I'd like to know is examples of other communities in the United States that have been able to maintain character while being very successful financially.
It's a very shrewd question, actually. And I can only think of examples that support your skepticism, your question. I think about the Pearl District, for example, in Portland, which is planned as well as any neighborhood in the country, and yet has had the life leached out of it because it's become a victim of its own success. So I don't know that I can think of a place that has been managed to reverse that cycle. There are a lot of examples of places that fall victim to it, and you're right, absolutely.
I agree. I think it's almost, it seems as if positive publicity is always going to lead to higher prices, because it leads to demand, and so that's a real catch-22, isn't it?
Well, one thing I'll say is that we could think of it in simple economic terms. If the prices are going up, there's one way to deal with that, and that's increase the supply. And that means more units, more multifamily units, a different kind of approach to density. So that means opening it up to more people. Different kinds of units, smaller units, things that can be more affordable for the unit.
The thing that supports that idea is what sounds like a kind of a, you didn't have to be a wealthy person to buy in Sea Ranch in the beginning. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that you must be a wealthy person to buy in Sea Ranch today. Am I right about that? Maybe not. It seems like it's heading that way, which is why it supports what Chris is suggesting. And obviously, you want to manage density and population growth, but to offer people different kinds of accommodation here across a range of sizes is one way to attract a more diverse community.
Can I make one comment?
Okay, we're running over time, but
Okay, just one little one. Sea Ranch is not, in terms of transportation, very sustainable and never will be with a 10-mile stretch. But we do have probably one of the nation's highest per capita rate of Prius owners here. Okay, one last question. Amy?
Perhaps this will be a good ending question. I first want to thank all of you. You've given us so much of your wisdom and expertise and a lot of things to think about. But I also, in homage to Larry and Anna, who I've been dancing with for over 10 years, want to respond to the R part of the RSVP, which is resources. And I look out at this room of 150, 200 people, and I wanted to know what the next steps following today are, and really turn it back on them. There are so many talented, smart people who love this place, and I have a feeling a lot of the answers to the questions that have been raised today can be found in this room.
I'm sure they think so.
Yeah, whether it's the bench committee or the bike path committee or the grocery store committee or whatever it is. So I'm curious if there are some plans or discussions about what will happen after today.
thank you. And thank you all. So, what?
You're not going to answer that?
That's a question.
It is definitely the case that there is, as Jackie has said, there is a follow-on workshop kind of forum that will take place for members of the community. It has been scheduled for February. It's not probably going to be February now, but somewhat later. But that's absolutely a part of our program, is to have a follow-on wherein people get engaged in trying to think through what these issues are. And part of it will be an agenda developed from this meeting.
Okay, thank you all. There is... And we can continue, I know you'll continue talking with all of us. Outside the barn, there is your reward waiting, wine and cheese and stuff.